Hello, I'm Charlie Etheridge Nunn. Welcome to Who Dares Rolls. Very recently, Mike put out a list article of different board games that fit different categories, things that he doesn't like, things that he reckons are underappreciated, anything like that. So I figured, why not steal a good idea that I gather was stolen anyway, and do the same but for role-playing games. First of all, an RPG I don't like. Now, I do try and remain mostly positive about things on this channel. So we're gonna blast through these first ones. An RPG I don't like. There are so many that have good aspects, and I do tend to just not bother anymore with ones where it's not good, but people do it all the time, anything like that, or old favourites or whatever. For me, GURPS, the generic universal role-play system. The game itself had some fun elements as far as character creation. That in itself is a nice kind of play to do. Admittedly, there are a couple of odd elements with certain point balancing of buying things. I remember an old GM of mine made a friend of ours in GURPS and came out at negative points, which felt like the longest, most specific diss on a person ever. The system itself, though, feels entirely flavourless, and I get that it's generic, but that only feels like it's aged worse and worse over time as you get more generic systems that are toolkits that really need a lot of hacking, a lot of modification to help the mechanics reflect the theme and tone. And GURPS just reduces everything to the same sort of grey paste. Again, that's just my opinion. I've given it a go a couple of times and it's just never sat right. And for any of the genres that I've played or seen, while the GURPS books have been good source books, there's always a better system for it. So that's GURPS. Second negative one here. The RPG, I think, is overhyped. Now, this one is an obvious choice. It is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, it gets a lot of people into the hobby. Unfortunately, it takes about 90% of the oxygen. And that's like if 90% of hobby board gamers, not general families or anything, were all playing Monopoly or all playing Settlers of Catan. It's fine to a point, but just get more voices out, more stuff, more options. And I know the fandom is rabid enough that even this kind of milquetoast statement on D&D of going, it's fine, but there's more, is often seen as an attack. So I'm going to move swiftly on. So, the first of my show and tell here, a game I think is underappreciated. It's going to be Fate. Fate is, again, it's a generic toolbox system, but it is very much a toolbox. It's the kind of thing you can easily hack, easily craft things out of. It's narrative enough to have annoyed a lot of the more trad GMs that I knew back in the day who think it's too woolly, and it's also too standard role-play kind of feel to get a lot of indie love, but when it does, it works wonders. Recently I've played Fate of Cthulhu, I've played iHunt, and they're both amazing. Some really good games, really good uses. The system itself is quite basic, and despite the length of the book, it's a really quick read. It's nice, easily modified, and the world books that have been created are amazing. Each one is a sumptuous world that you want to dive into, whether it's King Arthur mechs in space or a weird, creepy apartment building that no one can ever leave and seems to get more abstract as it goes. Or even their Fate worlds, kind of individual worlds, such as ones where you play cats or superheroes or even DJs battling each other in a weird cyberpunk future. So Fate is definitely underappreciated in my books. Next we have an RPG I love. Now, the books themselves aren't out yet, but Trophy. This is a Trophy trifold I've shown off previously, but the Trophy games are just beautiful. They're the kind of games where, when I read the system for Trophy Gold, I wasn't 100% sure on it, but the moment I played, just going from that sort of, I think I know what I'm doing here, I'm not sure, to just the feel of being in that world, of having that collaborative fantasy horror with the players. It proves that you can be a horror GM without being a dick to your players. All of those old school RPGs that are like, oh yeah, you need to trick them, or, you know, your kind of John Wick tactics of jump out of a cupboard and go boo to your players or anything like that. You don't need any manipulation. What you need as your biggest weapon against the players is the players, and you need them to buy in on that. So Trophy Dark is an RPG about doomed adventurers going to a forest that doesn't want them there to take something that doesn't belong to them. They are doomed. I know it, the players know it, and we're all going to have a lot of fun watching the very dark, very weird, very kind of like that A24 sort of vibe horror increase and consume the cast. And then Trophy Gold replaces doomed adventurers with desperate adventurers, making a joyously dark, weird OSR but narrative kind of style for going through different dungeons, different adventures. And you'd have to be mental to go on any of these adventures. And this shows those adventurers who really shouldn't go on this, who will, despite any sane minds, any sane thought going, no, don't go in these dungeons, don't go in these forests, clamber over these city rooftops, anything like that. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And it adds a kind of lyricism to that horror, which I really appreciate. So, an RPG I can play over and over again as my next one, Masks, A New Generation. I love superheroes. I love young, dumb superheroes who don't really know what they're doing, but they're gonna do it anyway. Gillian and McKelvey's Young Avengers, for instance. The New Mutants, Generation X, Young Justice, any of these kind of things. This perfectly replicates that kind of mentality in a narrative system where you are both discovering who you are and trying to fight crime, stop bad guys, deal with interdimensional threats. Kiss, be intimidated by any of your teammates, just have a whale of a time. It is brightly coloured fun. And I've done a couple of seasons, I've done a few one-shots, both as player and GM, and I just can't get enough of it. So, the game I wish I could play more often is Monster Hearts. I've run a bunch of Monster Hearts. I've only ever run it as 1 or 2 shots. This is a game, again, it's got young protagonists who don't really know what they're doing, but they're going to do it anyway. And in this case, what they're going to do is be awful, just the worst. This replicates the monstrousness of adolescence and the monstrousness of monsters. You could be a vampire coolly keeping people away, while desperately also kind of after their attention. You could be the mortal obsessively stalking one of the supernatural creatures, the witch constantly stealing things and hexing people, the ghost blaming everyone else for anything that's gone wrong in your life while sitting silently at the back of the class. You have been one of these terrible teenagers, but this puts that wonderful kind of televisual drama of Vampire Diaries, of Buffy, all of that, as well as the more explicit horror and just the mundanity of teenage life, really. Like, I'd conquer the world, but, my dad's grounded me and all of that kind of stuff. Brilliant fun. Really want to do a campaign of that one day and not knock it over on the big pile of books I've just shown off. Next up, we have the RPG that changed my life. Now, this is the modern version of it, but Fiasco really, really changed who I am as a GM, as a host, facilitator, as a role player. This showed me the more improv level of gaming. It showed me how prepless things can be, because you just get a bunch of cards in this, or a little playbook in the original edition for a scenario. You get some dice and you go at it. It allowed me to give power over narrative to others, because it's a GM-less game, and I wasn't used to those at all at that time. I was a lot more into, firstly, your D&Ds, your World of Darkness games, your ones which are still very traditionally GM and players with that kind of power structure. But the sort of negotiated realities that we created in Fiasco, they told a story we didn't expect, but felt right. And Fiasco's great for that. It's one of several GM-less collaborative games that I adore and can always bring out. Others include things like Lovecraft-esque. There's definitely been a lot more of them these days, and even GM full games where everyone takes an element of a GM. But Fiasco was my first love as far as all that goes. It's the kind of game that made me rethink how I ran other role-playing games, and brought me into communities such as the Story Games community back in the Google Plus days, the Google Plus Story Games kind of people, the Gauntlet community, all of that, and gave me a real appreciation for narrative and how to play in that space. The game that surprised me the most, is this, which I keep bringing out to some of these videos, and it's always surprising how heavy it is, but that's not the reason it's the most surprising game. This is the Yellow King. I love Robert Chambers' work. I love the Yellow King cycle, despite issues with old HPL himself. A lot of the Hasta things in Chambers', Lovecraft's, anyone else's work. I always love that kind of meta horror. And not only did this provide me a setting and a world in the 1890s Paris, in the art scene, specifically with art students, it was a real joy and really fun. And I expected the system to be a lot drier than it was. This uses the quick shot version of the gumshoe system. And the system was a lot nicer in play than I thought things like the combat side of it would have been. The use of the investigative abilities was really nice. The players using their pushes was really good. And it was a real joy. It's a game I knew that I'd like, but I thought I'd be wrestling against the system rather than smoothly sailing along with it. So that was really good. Hopefully in the next year I'll be able to get the second campaign of that played, which is the Wars. Next up, we've got a tie for my guilty pleasure. As I said, I started out with your D&D type games. I moved on to your World of Darknesses and the earlier versions of these two games by one John Wick, no, not the guy from the films. He incorporates a lot of world building, a lot of elements of real world kind of history that isn't just America or medieval fantasy, and there's an amount of success, an amount of failure in both of them. Both of these new editions are a lot better than their previous ones, both mechanically, at least in 7th Sea, yet to have a chance to do 5 Rings yet, but also with a lot more consideration. 7th Sea especially had a lot more people actually of the cultures that are being written about contributing. And 5 Rings, while it's still got a certain amount of issues of dealing with fantasy Asia, there's still a lot more care being taken here than there has been previously. For 5 Rings, you play one of several different clans who are themed around different animals, so crab, crane, dragon, lion, phoenix, scorpion, and unicorn. But there are other little ones. In a kind of fantasy Asia sort of place, you got samurai, you got Shigenja, which are kind of elemental mages. It's a setting with a lot of depth and a lot of breadth, and even more importantly, a lot of spaces for your player characters. And that's really good. For 5 Rings, I'd say if you're unsure, check out the streams that Asians Represent did going through L5R. They got an actual Asian history scholar there who didn't really know much about role-playing games but knew about history, and got one of the actual authors of some of the L5R content as well, who was a real joy on there, and even community folks. So that's really good. 7th Sea is swashbuckling. It's in fake Europe, but is expanded out to fake Americas, Africa, Middle East, all of that. And again, the world built in here is great. It's got a lot of space for you as the protagonists, and not everyone cares for the system, especially in the new one, where you get a kind of baseline success that you're trying to get, but also a level of different risks that you're trying to beat, and your option of what you succeed or fail at with that. So that's cool. I've realised I've gone slightly out of order here because I completely forgot about the RPG that got me into the hobby. That RPG is Vampire the Masquerade. It was 93, and I think it was 93. I was getting into the Overpower card game because I'm a big X-Men fanboy, then from there into Magic the Gathering, and from there into Vampire the Eternal Struggle, or Jihad, which luckily they thought to name it something else other than back then, and went into Vampire the Eternal Struggle. I'd just been reading things like Bram Stoker's Dracula, so I was in the mood for some vampire shenanigans. Played Vitesse, enjoyed it, and in the back of the rulebook there was some kind of storytelling game, and I like telling stories, and I figured it was a card game, much like a few storytelling card games we had in the house, including Shaggy Dogfish, which I think is so obscure it's not even on BGG. It was picked up from a rando at a festival. I'll show it off one day. But Vampire the Masquerade was something I asked for a Christmas. I got given, and it was a big hardback book. I had no idea what to do with that. Didn't have any 10-sided dice, which for dice you need for it. So we used bits of paper. I had a fairly abortive attempt at running it, and left it a little while, and then picked up Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in a big yellow board game style box set, and after enjoying that for a bit, went back to Vampire. And that was one of the big games that I did all through the New World of Darkness era. even, and it's only been the last decade, I think, that I've not really played any World of Darkness. Next up, the game that I should have played but haven't. So you may have noticed from this and previous videos, I'm a big old Gauntlet fanboy. I love the trophy games. I've loved Brindlewood Bay. Every time that I've read one of their rule sets, I've fallen in love with it. And so it has been with The Between. The Between is a kind of Penny Dreadful style investigative game. A lot of the mechanics are similar to Brindlewood Bay, but replacing old ladies in a seaside town to London in Victorian England, and a lot of brooding supernatural people who have dark secrets that you do not share, in a rare moment for a lot of more narrative story games. Instead, you let the horrors come out, because if you've seen Penny Dreadful, a lot of things could have been solved if those bastards had spoken to each other and done anything, instead of just let it all slowly consume them. This similarly goes along those kind of routes. So you are progressing your character in their fairly probably doomed narrative, but also you're carrying out investigations which aren't necessarily just murders, and each one has amounts of difficulty for the clues that you get, the locations you go to. It's very evocative, and it includes things like the unseen, which is a scene that's not really a scene. It's just moments happening completely disconnected from your main plot, but evocative of London at the time, of the themes and the ideas, to intercut between the nighttime phase and the unseen, to help measure time and build a sense of the world a bit more. And I really want to see that in play. I want to see how it works and get under the hood of that system. Somehow, I've still not got around to it yet. And finally, the RPG I'm most excited for. There was a shout out for this in one of my previous videos, my update for March, but Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. This is by Possum Creek Games, who did Sleepaway and Wander Home. It's a game where you go chapter by chapter through a book, which is, I think, about 500 pages or so. There are several different scenes, each of which have a different game and tell a different story, each one about 1 to 2 hours. There are pre-built characters, all of whom work in or are guests at a bed and breakfast. And when you turn to a page, when you open up a chapter, it tells you which people you're playing and what you're doing. So it may be that someone's putting on a play. It may be that the washing machines need fixing. It could be all manner of things, and it will say, these characters are involved, pick them, get some tokens, some playing cards, anything like that. This is how the game goes, and this is how the story will progress. So it tells what looks like gentle, but not necessarily kind of gentle to a fault, or only that. Like, some are quite wistful, some may be a bit sad or a bit spooky or anything like that, but you are telling these stories almost episode by episode of a bed and breakfast where it is always the same date, where these people have roamed for a long time and the guests come and go. And the guest could be a skeleton, for instance. The people working there could be a demonic child called Hate Kid. Could be a masked girl who sleeps on the washing machines and is the only person without a room of her own. Could be a robot. Could be a dashing knight turned into a frog. Could be all manner of different things. And it's a legacy game. So you use stickers to modify the book and you unlock chapters. You might unlock a bonus guest or a bonus playable staff member. It sounds joyous and weird and really interesting. It's currently on Indiegogo. I know it's well into its stretch goals now, which is really reassuring to see for a campaign that's not on Kickstarter. So that's the RPG I'm most excited for, although give me 5-10 minutes and I'm sure there'll be another one that I'll be incredibly excited for as well. That's it from me. Are there any RPGs in these categories that you want to comment and say, oh, actually, this is a game I want to play more often, or this was a game that surprised me? Mention in the comments or on whatever social medias this has been put out on as well. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, all of the usual. If you're feeling really generous, please go to Patreon. We have, well, at least I have, fairly pound shop equipment here, so any patronage would be marvellous. And until next time, have a nice time, and I'll see you soon.